For those of you who may be wondering, Laura and I have moved. We're in the new house. It took a lot. I was working till midnight for 2 solid weeks, pretty much. So you talk about being tired. I'm right there. I actually I had to go to the doctor. They told me that I have what is called stress-induced eczema. And I can't get my wedding finger on my ring because it's all swollen up. My wedding ring on my... I'm tired, folks. I'm tired, okay?
Oh my goodness.
But we're home. We have a home, and it's wonderful. And just to kind of tie in and share, there was one night where Laura called me, and I was at the house, and I was going to be there for like another 3 hours or something. Putting down flooring, and she called me, and you know, we kind of talked about how when I come home, because you know, working this job, I work a lot of hours, but they're very flexible, and a lot of them can be home. So I actually get to be home with my wife a lot more than most people who work 40, 50, 60 hours a week do. And these past couple of weeks have been different. And so I would come home at night, and she would tell me that the baby would move when I would walk in and start speaking, as though the baby would hear my voice and recognized me. And we had that conversation, and she said, well, the baby misses you. And I said, well, tell the baby I go to prepare a place for it. And it's funny, but it's true. That's literally what I was doing. I was off preparing a place and a home for that baby, and in that moment, in that specific moment, I got a little taste of how God loves us and how God cares for us and what God does for us. And that was one of the coolest moments of my life. And I just thought I'd share that with you this morning. We have been on an unofficial sermon series over the past 4 weeks now, I think it's been, uncovering the personality of God, kind of looking through mostly Old Testament scriptures to see how he reveals himself. Because if we're going to call ourselves friends of God, which is one of the origins of the name of our denomination, if we're going to do that, we need to know the one whom we call friend. And so I didn't plan this. Normally, if there's a sermon series, I've thought it out and I've planned it and I've kind of worked through what it's going to be. This has just kind of happened. So I take it that it's very important for us as a church, especially moving forward, to kind of reacquaint ourselves with the person of God, with who he is. And today, oh wait, I have jokes. I'm tired. I really am. There's a man suspected of theft, and the crime he was suspected of having committed was breaking into a house and stealing. He only had a moment, and so he stole what he could on the nightstand. So cash, obviously, but oddly, dentures. So the police took him in for questioning, and they just couldn't get a straight answer. They couldn't trip him up, but something wasn't right, so they hooked him up to a polygraph, and they found out that he was lying through somebody else's teeth. There was a store clerk was being interviewed by the police, and the police said, so the man that robbed you came in, and you said he helped himself to 3 bags of pretzels, cash out of the cash register, pants. Is that correct? That's correct, said the store clerk, and the policeman go, and you didn't chase him? No, I didn't chase him. Well, that's good. We encourage people not to chase because we don't know if these criminals are dangerous or if they're armed or anything like that. And the guy said, well, I would have chased him, but it was my pair of pants. Do you know what happens when cats get out of prison? They go on parole. That one was for you. My wife loves cats. I don't. There's your jokes. And now to completely shift back to what we were talking about earlier. We are going to be looking at Daniel. We're going to be looking specifically at the 3rd chapter, but I want to give a brief kind of a brief context to the first and second chapters because they play into the third chapter a little bit. Daniel is a book of prophecy and narrative, and they're kind of interwoven together in a fairly unique manner. It's a fascinating book to read. It's a difficult book to read. I encourage you to try because the narrative is fascinating and there's a lot of insight to be had there. But the prophecy can trip you up and it can be weird and just be aware of that when you go into Daniel. The first chapter of Daniel, the book of Daniel begins during the exile. So the children of Israel took the promised land. They established a kingdom. They fell away from God, as has been the pattern of human beings since time immemorial. They fall away from God, and God finally goes, okay, we have established this covenant. You are going to be my people. You're not being my people, so I got to fix this. So I'm going to send you away. Babylon is going to come in, conquer you, take you away, but I will bring you back to the promised land, and then you'll follow me again. This takes place during that exile. Daniel was one of the nobility in Jewish society. He was a handsome, young, rich, intelligent man. And those types of people in Babylon, when Babylon would conquer another country, they had a very enlightened process. Babylon would conquer another country, and they would take the cream of the crop, all of the nobility, the handsome, the rich, the intelligent, and they would put them in the service of the king and kind of incorporate the political structure of the conquered kingdom into their own and nationalize them. And Daniel was one such person. In Daniel 1 and 2, we get to a couple of stories about how Daniel and a couple of his friends are being integrated into Babylonian society. The first chapter is Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are taken and given food from the king's table, and they're being educated in Babylonian customs and culture and politics and religion and the whole thing. And Daniel goes, instead of giving us wine and meat, can we have the vegetables and water, please? Because everybody loves going on a diet. But there's a story there about how Daniel, because he followed the traditions and precepts of his country and would not defile himself with that of another country, even though they'd been captured and were imprisoned, it came out better for them, and everybody ended up having vegetables and water instead of meat and wine, which is a great way to make friends, by the way. That was another joke. There we go. So, Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah are given Babylonian names. They are known as Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You may have heard those last three names before. Oftentimes we talk about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What we don't realize is that those are two different languages. We're using two different sets of names. The Babylonian names for these three young men who joined Daniel in requesting the vegetables and water, in standing up for their cultural customs, in standing up for their God, were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 2, Daniel interprets a dream for the king, and the king realizes that this is not only not only a young man who has all of the qualities and qualifications that they look for when they incorporate another nationality into his court, that this young man has prophetic ability and has the ability to interpret dreams, and there is a wisdom beyond simple mortal intelligence in him. And so he, and along with his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are elevated and promoted. Daniel becomes the second in command over the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are, and there I did it again, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are given rule over provinces and over areas, and they become essentially governors. But that brings us to chapter 3. Through this whole process, God has been revealing himself to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon at the time, and the way that the world and society and politics and religion worked back then is that the king was the king because the god had invested himself into that king. And so whatever the god of the nation was, the king of that nation was either the God incarnate, an avatar of that God, an offspring of that God, had some investiture of that God in himself. And you'll see this throughout the Old Testament, that God will not necessarily busy himself with changing the minds of all the individuals of the other countries. He focuses on the king because the king is the representation of that entire country and that entire religion. And this instance is no different. Nebuchadnezzar not only stood for his god, Nebo or Nabu, which they disagree on the pronunciation, but he also stood for Babylon. And so if Nebuchadnezzar recognized God's power, Yahweh's power, then Babylon would recognize it. And through the first 2 chapters, Nebuchadnezzar has been giving lip service to Yahweh. He has been acknowledging that Yahweh is a God of power, that Yahweh is a God of Israel, and that Yahweh is not insignificant. And he makes special concessions for the Jews due to the actions of Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so that the Jews could worship more freely in Babylon their God. But then chapter 3 happens. We're going to skip verses 1 through 7. The basic idea of those verses is that Nebuchadnezzar made a golden image of his god, Nebo or Nabu, and required that everybody in Babylon, when the music starts playing, bows down and worships it. This was not a demand for a state religion so much as it was a demand for a recognition of Nebuchadnezzar's power and the might of Babylon. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar didn't care if people worshipped other gods. He just wanted to make sure that everybody acknowledged Babylon's supremacy and Babylon's place in the world hierarchy, both politically and religiously. Okay? So, the stage has been set. We're going to pick up in verse 8. Therefore, at the time, certain Chaldeans, which is another name for Babylonians, came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Now there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall be immediately cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" So, without the context, this just seems like Nebuchadnezzar is just lording his power over the hapless Jews, right? Isolated, this story seems like a megalomaniac making sure that every person in his country is going to do what he says. But with the context of the previous 2 chapters, we kind of get a different flavor of this scene. You can imagine in the context of how Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have behaved and comported themselves and been trusted, maybe this scene played out a little bit differently, that when these 3 are brought before Nebuchadnezzar, he looks up and goes, "Guys, you? You? Really? Come on. You guys, I've trusted you. I know you. Like, we've worked together. We've talked things out. I know you guys. Why are you doing this? Now, I've made this decree, and I got to stick with it. So I'm going to give you another chance. If you guys are ready, I can have the band start playing again. And when the band starts playing, just kneel down and worship. It's okay. I recognize that this doesn't mean you're renouncing Yahweh. It's what you got to do. Look, I understand that these guys, they're out for you. I understand that. Here's your loophole. Here's your way through. Just do this, and it'll all be fine. That's a very different scene than this is often presented, isn't it? Or often comes to our minds first. It's a scene of a man who is caught between a rock and a hard place, of a king who has been caught by his own decree, and now he has to do something he doesn't want to do. Nebuchadnezzar becomes a sympathetic figure in this story. We continue in verse 16. In verse 15, that phrase, "And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" That's not so much megalomania as the understanding of what a king was in those days. Remember, he was invested by a god. He had the power of a god. He either was a god, was the scion of a god, etc., right? So this was not an unheard of proclamation from a king. This is what a king would have been expected to say in these circumstances. Nebuchadnezzar is not the bad guy here. We continue. Verse 16. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, 'O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you on this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known that to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.' Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace." Now, I want to it seems a contradiction, right? Nebuchadnezzar's not the bad guy here, and then all of a sudden he gets filled with rage and throws them in the furnace. Again, what you have to understand is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are resetting the parameters of reality as Nebuchadnezzar understands them, right? They are saying to him, "You are claiming to be divine, at least in part. We are denying that claim because we serve the divine who is so far above you, it makes you look like us. We serve him, we will serve him alone. We cannot worship or fall down in any way, shape, or form to some other God, because our God is the one true God." And Nebuchadnezzar, who can save us from your hand? He can. He might not, but he can. And so Nebuchadnezzar, having the foundations of his understanding of the way the world works, gets angry, gets furious. And that's a normal human reaction, right? When your basic understanding of how the world operates gets ripped apart or challenged in any significant way, human beings either react with fear, cutting humor, or anger. Those are the 3 common reactions. Apparently Nebuchadnezzar was a rage kind of guy. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace. Continue on in verse 24. "Then Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?' They answered and said to the king, 'True, O king.' He answered and said, 'But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods.' Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, 'Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads were not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, no smell of fire had come upon them. But Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was not the bad guy. He just had a faulty understanding of the reality of the world that he lived in, right? God, and we know this story. This is one of the most famous Bible stories. People who've never read the Bible before, never been to church before, have heard this story, right? The three men in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Fiery furnace has become a euphemism in the English language because of this story. We know this story, but there are layers and there are subtleties to this story that requires the context of the rest of the book, and I want to bring those out. Now, to state the obvious, the fourth individual in that fire does not have to be Jesus, but it is representative of the Christ, right? We see this, we recognize this. This is the obvious point of the story. It's the overt reason it was included in Scripture, right? Because it predicts Christ coming to unbind us from the fires of punishment, right? Everybody understands that. We don't need to spend more time on that because it's overt and obvious, and we get it. It might have been Jesus. We don't have any indication it was. It might have been him. Some people like to say it was. Whether it was or was not, it predicted him. It was the archetype of the Christ, okay? We get that. I want to turn and look at what this reveals about the character of God, because that's been our theme for the last couple of weeks, right? So, they were untouched by punishment. Is that a true or false statement? Which punishment? Because here's the interesting thing that reveals the nature of God. They were untouched by the punishment of the fire, yet they were in exile. They, as a nation, as a people, were being punished by God. Isn't that interesting? That in the midst of punishment, in the midst of righteous, deserved punishment, the nation of Israel was saved from persecution, was saved from unjust punishments. And this reveals the nature of God in his attention to justice and his understanding of order and propriety and rightness. This punishment was brought around by the manipulations of evil men, right? You go back to verse 8, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. There were entire factions within the Babylonian Empire who hated the Jews. He hated Jerusalem, hated the entirety of the people for whatever reason we don't know. And they kept trying to find ways, trying to find opportunities to crush these people. The book of Esther also takes place during this time period, and that entire book is about the factions within the kingdom that are trying to crush the Jews. This was a big deal. But the righteous and deserved and just punishment of the exile did not mean that things were going to be heaped on them, right? God, even in the midst of teaching a lesson and punishing and drawing Israel back to himself as a nation, protected the individuals who stood up in the moment against those who would snuff out the Word of God, snuff out the people of God, and provided a miracle. The miracle of flames doing nothing but releasing the bonds holding them together, freeing them. And in this, we get a picture of our God, one who allows nature to run its course, one who allows consequences to be felt of our decisions, our actions, others' decisions, others' actions. But when people try to cheat the rules, when people try to manipulate us as followers of God into bad circumstances, one who will deliver us. Our decisions matter. We talked about that last week. Consequences matter. Our decisions are run through. God honors our choices and the consequences of those choices, but He will not, He absolutely will not let us be maliciously manipulated into bad situations without coming through for us. It's when they were stuck, it's when they had to choose between God and life that God said, all right, miracle time. This is our God. This is whom we serve. God doesn't get fooled by shiftiness. There are people out there who, for whatever reason, are bent on destroying the church, on destroying the faith of Christianity, are bent on destroying everything we know about a good God. And He's not fooled by it. Now, we will feel consequences of it sometimes, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were sitting and they heard this was coming and they were like, oh, great. Maybe nobody will notice, right? Maybe nobody will notice. This will just blow over. We won't bow down. And then people were watching. And they brought him before the king, and the king goes, guys, I want to give you a loophole. I want to help you out. And they said, we got to stand. We can't bow down. We've got to stand. Because God is not fooled by shiftiness. God is not going to be manipulated into bringing harm to His people because people don't like Him. We don't need, as Christians, as people of God, we don't need to worry about people going outside the rules, outside of the law to get us in trouble as long as we stand for God. Now, there was no promise that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were going to come through that fire. There was no promise of a miracle. If they had burned in that fire and they had died, they would have been with their Lord, and that's a greater reward than actually what they got, than the miracle that they received. The miracle was not for them. It was for us, to reveal to us the nature of our God. Third thing that we can take from this. The first is that the exile was punishment and God still protected His faithful. The second thing is that God is not fooled by shiftiness. The third thing is that God spoke in the language of the day. He spoke to Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar was the source of the power, and where Nebuchadnezzar went, the nation followed. God spoke in the language of the day. You see this in the conquest of the Canaan land. If you go back to the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, the conquest of the Canaan land, it was not one nation warring against another as we understand it today. These nations that warred against each other were the representations of their God. And so when God says, go, take this city, conquer it, burn it to the ground, He's saying, I am showing my dominion and power over their God. I am killing their God. I am burning their God to the ground. He spoke in the language of the day. When Jesus came and walked on this earth, He walked into the synagogues. He walked before Pontius Pilate. He spoke with the religious leaders. He spoke in the language of the day. He was crucified on a cross because that was the horrific punishment of the day. Today, it would be a firing squad. Today, it would be some other form of punishment, of execution. He spoke in the language of the day, and this is comforting to us. This is for us because God speaks in our language. He understands the cultural shifts that go on outside these walls, and He starts moving in response to them because He wants to speak to every person. And that ties back to that thing I've been saying ad nauseum, and I'm not going to stop. The church is one of the few organizations that exists primarily for those who are not yet a part of it. The church is one of the few organizations in this entire world that exists primarily for those who are not yet a part of it, because our God speaks in the language that the people outside of these walls can understand. He speaks in a language that they will hear and come to him and get to know him as we do. And the church exists primarily for those who are not yet a part of it. God spoke to Nebuchadnezzar because as Nebuchadnezzar went, so went Babylon. God didn't speak to Nebuchadnezzar because he was special. God didn't speak to Nebuchadnezzar because there was something unique about him. He spoke to Nebuchadnezzar because that was the entirety of the Babylonian nation. If you continue in the book of Daniel, you see Nebuchadnezzar finally coming to God, finally giving lip service. If you read the end of chapter 3, you see that he acknowledges that Yahweh is God. Yahweh is a greater God than he is. You also see that he acknowledges that people should be punished for speaking out against Yahweh. And so, but he never admits that Yahweh could be his God. He acknowledges that Yahweh is a stronger God than he is. And then to appease this stronger God, he promotes his prophets. He promotes the ones that he saved. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get elevated positions out of this whole thing because Nebuchadnezzar is trying to appease Yahweh. If you continue into chapter 4, verse 28, you see that Nebuchadnezzar did not understand what it truly was. And in chapter 4:28 and on, you will get a story of how Nebuchadnezzar finally came to understand that Yahweh is God. And I encourage you to go read that. It is a phenomenal story. But the three things we understand about God, the three things that we can learn about our God from this passage, other than the prophetic Christological implications and archetypes that came in the fiery furnace with the fourth individual, even in punishment, our God will save us. He allows us to endure right punishment. He saves us from unjust punishment. We serve a God of justice and mercy. God does not get fooled by shiftiness. He will not let his people be backed into a corner. Therefore, we can proceed straight forward with our eyes open and not worry about people slinking around in the shadows around us trying to badmouth us because God saves us from them. And third, God speaks in the language of the day. And this is the one that may be the most pertinent to us. Maybe. God speaks in the language of the day. Are we? Church? Do we speak in the language of those who live in our community that don't come here? Do our actions as a body and as individuals convey a meaning that they understand? I don't have an answer for that question. I don't. Because it's up to you, Science Hill. It's up to you to take into consideration the language of the world around us. To take into consideration the movement of the God that we serve and to see where those intersect. Quakerism is not easy. There's a lot of personal responsibility. Now, if you want to have a conversation about it, if you want to talk about it, discuss it, work it through with somebody, I got 12 office hours a week. I'm here. My phone number is in the bulletin. Get a hold of me. If you don't want to get a hold of me, get a hold of one of the elders on ministry and council. They'd be happy to talk with you as well. But we have a personal responsibility as individuals to make sure that we, as individuals and a body, are speaking the language of our community and our day. And I don't know what that will result in. I'm pretty sure it will probably result in some changes, but I don't know if those are corporate changes, individual changes, personal changes, because society keeps moving. So God keeps changing how he's talking. We got to keep up. We got to keep up. And we can keep up with open eyes. We can keep up without fear that somebody's going to back us into a corner. We can keep up without worrying about the shiftiness of the people who are trying to attack us because God will protect us from them. And if we make a mistake and we do something that God says, you know what, that's wrong, and you need to learn from that, and He punishes us, we need not fear anything beyond that, because He only brings what we deserve in His name, in His will. So friends, I encourage you to examine what God is doing. Are we speaking the language of the world, of the day? Are we moving where God is going in the way He's going? Because we can do that without fear. And I encourage you to make that examination and to make those reflections personally without fear. Because He's going to protect us from the ramifications of people trying to drive us into the ground, people trying to get us from the side and out of the shadows. He protects us. So church, go forward without fear. Make your personal examinations and personal reflections without fear. And we have monthly meeting right after this. And if something comes out of that, either this monthly meeting or next monthly meeting, where we go, hey, it's time for a corporate change. It's time maybe for the church to do a little bit something differently as a body. That's where we bring it up. And we can bring it up without fear because we are following the same God, following the God who loosed 3 men from bonds in a furnace that killed those that were throwing them in it. It was so hot that it killed the guys who got close. That's the God we serve. The one who will protect us, the one who frees us, the one who sends us through fire, not to punish us, but to free us from our bonds, and free us from our shackles. Will you pray with me? Father God, this morning, I pray that you would remove fear, that you would keep from our hearts and our minds and the examinations and the questioning that we do, Father, as Quakers. I pray that you would remove fear from that you would remind us and comfort us in the fact that you have got us. That whatever anybody else tries to throw at us, Father, you've got us. And I pray that as we leave this place and we go out into the world, Lord, that you would be with us, that as we consider the changes that we may have to make to keep up with what you're doing, Father, to keep up with the language of the day, that you are speaking to a people that you desire, Father, that you would be with us in that you would comfort us, that you would drive it, that you would give us vision and wisdom. And I pray all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Friends, at this time, as we look at moving outside of the walls, as we turn our attention from the centered downness of worship back to the cares of this world, I want to give you an opportunity to voice some prayer concerns. Is there someone who comes into your mind as we look back to this outside world who needs prayer from this body?
The granddaughter of Leo Staley. My name is Faith Victoria Garner. She's had some lung issues and has been in intensive care at Wake Forest Baptist. She's only 23, and she's had some rough times. So remember them, please.
The family of Frankie Staley have 4 boys and a wife, and he committed suicide Friday. And you really pray for them.
Yeah.
Greta Lynn, old Sioux person,